Welcome back, viewers, to another episode of Environmental History Worth Reading, our monthly series of what's best on the internet in environmental history. I'm Sean Courage, one of the editors here at niche-canada.org, and I'm joined by Jessica.
I'm Jessica DeWitt, and I am the social media editor for Niche.
I'm already excited just based on the feature image for this week's post of Paul Bunyan, but I suppose we'll get there. We begin with a Canadian article here written by Naomi Klein in Globe and Mail about Canada's founding myths and the role that they play in limiting our ability to address climate change.
hmm This was very popular on social media, very viral on our Facebook page. I think historians love it anytime that we can revisit the Staples thesis. So basically, Klein is referring to the Staples thesis and how Harold Innis discussed how Canada's reliance on export of raw materials stunts the growth of the nation. And she's connecting that to why, firstly, why the Canadian government is so slow to pick up on climate change science and to react to it and to make policies that will help reduce carbon emissions, and also why reconciliation is difficult in Canada because we keep taking lands away from Indigenous people for the extraction of raw materials. And as long as we keep doing that, reconciliation, she argues, is not entirely possible. So I think it's a good mix of current events and looking back on some classic Canadian history.
It ties in with some of the themes that came up at the Canadian History and Environment Summer School last spring in Banff, where we talked about the relationship between environment and reconciliation with First Nations. So this is, a must-read, I think, not just for environmental historians, but Canadians and other readers. We've got an article here referring to an interview on The Current, how Moby Doll changed the worldview of monster orca whales.
Yes, this is a really great episode of The Current, so I suggest listening to the entire thing. If people don't know, Moby Doll was an orca whale that was caught in July 1964, and they were meaning to kill him to use as a model for a sculpture in a museum, but they just wounded him and ended up taking him into captivity, and he was the first orca whale in captivity. And during this episode, they interview a historian, and they also interview a scientist who is working with Moby Doll and other orca whales that were in captivity. And it's just a really interesting look at how people realized that they weren't as frightening or as awful as people assumed. So there's kind of a buildup of love around these creatures, which led to more being brought into captivity and also to them being conservation efforts to save them. And the interview with the scientist is particularly interesting because he's pretty crotchety about current efforts to remove orca whales from captivity, because he says that kind of the sacrifice of a couple leads to saving the species. So, yeah.
And I love the slideshow here because you can see Stanley Park in the background. I'll also point out, too, there's a book chapter coming out in a new edited collection with the Niche series with University of Calgary Press on animals and cities that looks at cetaceans in captivity in Vancouver. And the role that captive whales have played in changing human-animal relations at the Vancouver Aquarium, not just for Canada, but globally. The Vancouver Aquarium was a leader in developing techniques and how could you put this, containment techniques for capturing whales and putting them on display. Over at the New York Times, this is where we come to Paul Bunyan. In an era of hyperbole, Paul Bunyan is as tall as ever.
Yeah, this is an interesting article that has an environmental history twist because, of course, Paul Bunyan is a folklore character that arose from the 19th century logging camps in the northern United States. So they're talking about how Paul Bunyan signifies I would say, North American obsession with wilderness, with the idea that resources are um, eternal, and
Hmm.
and also an obsession with masculinity, which I think draws back to some of the articles that were in our gender and environment series in the spring. They talked about how one of the things that Paul Bunyan is said to have done is to have turned the Dakotas into the prairies. So I think that's an interesting way to look at uh, the environmental history of the plains, and also erasure of indigenous peoples' role in creating the prairies through management of fire.
And
So
it's
it's a
like a
good
connection back to
article.
the Naomi Klein article too about
Hmm.
mythologies about natural resources in North
Yeah.
America and the
Hmm.
degree to which we got to think about connecting natural resource exploitation with colonialism in North American history and think about these
Yeah.
things together.
Yes.
We've got another podcast here, 99% Invisible, Making Up Ground. Now, this is an unusual story from the late 1970s about a discovery at a construction site in San Francisco.
Hmm. Yeah, they find an old ship underneath the ground, and they use that story to look at the way that San Francisco is basically built on uh, totally man-made ground, fill, where San Francisco is used to be water. And they look at a few other cities that were that's the case historically, and they talk about how the historic scale of fill is nothing compared to what's happening today in places like Dubai or Singapore. So they connect the historic with the contemporary, and how richer countries are stealing sand, basically,
Hmm.
from poorer countries. They're stealing the ground from them to make larger cities and whatnot. So it's a really interesting connection to present day issues.
And our final pick this month comes from Seeing the Woods, the Rachel Carson Center blog, and Yang Gao, one of the fellows at the Rachel Carson Center, is providing one of these posts. This is a fairly regular series, right? Where
Hmm.
Rachel Carson Center
Yes.
fellows provide posts.
Yes, they talk about why they became environmental historians, or entered the environmental humanities in the first place. So it's kind of connecting the personal with the scholarly. And in this one, which connects to the Making Up Ground issue episode, Gao talks about um, how the farming town that she grew up in was built on reclaimed wetlands,
Mm.
and that it was the existence of this town was totally dependent on the dike that separated it from the wetlands that still existed.
Hmm.
And she talks about how this got her interested in the management of water in China and the history thereof, and how water control, quote, is an essential mechanism of state-society relationships. So it's just a really interesting perspective on why she's studying water in China, and she connects it to some interesting present-day issues. So.
Well, this is another great list of 5 picks. Viewers can find links to all of these picks back at niche-canada.org for environmental history worth reading for September 2016. And join us again here next month for Jessica's picks for October. Jessica, thank you.
Thank you, Sean.